Now, over the years, we've seen a variety of different labels used by football boot brands to market their boots, to allow the average consumer to hopefully identify with one of the boots that they have on offer. And for a very long time, you were limited to basically three different categories: speed, power, and heritage. Heritage kind of implying older style boots, speed implying lightweight and typically very thin, and power boots, which were bulky, typically more tech forward in terms of a lot of, I would say, gimmicky elements most of the time, in a category that has since kind of gone away. But over the years, we've seen new categories of football boots introduced in an attempt to spark interest from consumers. But one in particular has definitely stuck and become very impactful. And I'm not talking about agility boots, I'm not talking about laceless boots, and I'm certainly not talking about zipper boots. I'm talking about control boots. Imagine trying to control the ball without control boots. In 2009, Nike introduced a fourth line of football boots to run along the Nike Mercurial, the Nike T90, and the Nike Tiempo, that line being the CTR360 Maestri, which initially was only available as a regular Maestri, but later down the line you could get an elite variant which featured a different stud pattern and, more importantly, a carbon fiber sole plate. And unlike so many new concepts that had a hard time making an impact and really sticking long term, not only was the CTR360, I think, a really well thought out and well designed football boot, the concept of a control boot, the ability to control the ball, is something that I think everybody identified with in one way or another. Just like how speed boots gave slow players hope that they could be faster, control boots gave people with the touch of a tree hope that they could have a better touch. So with that brief intro out of the way, hello and welcome to another retro reboot review. This is where we take an older boot, I give you a bit of a history lesson, we talk about the significance of that boot at that point in time, and also talk about how it performs and compares to the boots that we have now. If you guys enjoy the retro review series on the channel and want to see more of these videos, don't forget to support this one with a like and leave a suggestion for which boot you'd like to see a retro review of next down below in the comment section. And of course, if you're not subscribed to the channel already and don't want to miss out on weekly videos on everything football boots, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Now, I think it's safe to say that control boots over the last 11 years have changed a lot, to the point where the ones that we have now don't really relate all that closely to the CTR360 Maestri 1, but being that this was the very first mainstream control boot, I think that Nike did a really good job of introducing some design concepts that not only made sense to a lot of people, but were also very visual, because this was distinctively different looking, not only in comparison to the rest of Nike's lineup, but really in comparison to any other football boot that was available at that point in time. Now, the flagship element of the Maestri 1 was the kanga-lite upper, where you'll look at this upper and obviously it does have some texturing that is clearly not a natural type of texturing, but it also looks like it's made out of leather. It's not leather, it's a full synthetic upper called kanga-lite. And this is something that confused a lot of people for a very long time, and even still to this day, I get people messaging me saying, I have an old pair of CTR360s that has a kanga-lite upper, do I have to use leather cream on it? And the answer to that question is no, this is fully synthetic. The idea behind kanga-lite was to create a synthetic material that felt as close to kangaroo leather as possible from a touch and comfort standpoint, but didn't have the downsides of leather, which I will say leather uppers have improved drastically over the last 11 years as well. The treatment process have changed, but back in the day, what leather was kind of known for as somewhat of an older style material, because synthetics were becoming more and more popular, is that it would overstretch, it would get a little bit heavier, especially in wet weather, because it would absorb more water, it would take longer to dry, it would require a little bit more maintenance, and this had none of those downsides, but of course with the upside of still feeling like leather. And honestly, I think it did a pretty good job. Out of all the kanga-lite materials we ever got from Nike, I really do feel like one of the very best ones was actually featured on the CTR360 Maestri 1. It's not too thin, it's got just the right amount of padding, it's softened up really, really nicely, and honestly it just felt really good on feet. Also, the fact that the entire boot was made out of the same kanga-lite material just made for a very uniform touch across the entire foot. Now, something that was kind of controversial with this boot when it first came out was the lacing system, which you'll notice is pushed to the medial side. And at the time, One of the main technologies that you saw in a lot of football boots that were focused around striking the ball especially was the laces being pushed further and further to the outside of the boot, leaving you with this really clean surface to make contact with the ball. This moved the laces exactly in the spot where we were told up until that point you did not want laces. So a lot of people viewed this as a control boot that would totally hurt their ability to strike the ball because you're not supposed to make any contact with the laces. That couldn't be further from the truth, but the logic behind this is that they wanted to leave this area more so on the lateral side as well as across the top of your foot as clean as possible for the sake of control. And it did make for a very unique touch on the ball where you didn't have any lace obstruction in this area of the foot. It was cleaner in this area than any other football boot. And obviously since then, we've seen a lot of design variation similar to this. I would say the X Speed line from Adidas right now, the X19.1, one of the most popular boots on the market, has a lacing system similar to this, where it's not quite down the middle, it's actually more so pushed towards the medial side. And this actually does a pretty good job of not only feeling comfortable, but doing a really nice job of securing your foot in place once the laces are tied tight. Of course, this just features a regular tongue, also made from kanga-lite. And then in that area that they did free up, you can see they added these two little protruding pads right here. And what you're gonna find is that it's actually an insert of memory foam here and here to provide additional padding along with the kanga-lite, just to give you that little bit of a dampened sensation when making contact with the ball. And honestly, the memory foam pads, they're very noticeable. It does provide that little bit of extra cushion, more so than what you would find in a traditional kangaroo leather upper, but at the same time, it didn't feel bulky. So that's something that I think a lot of people really enjoyed about the CTR360 Maestri 1, including myself. And then moving to the medial side, you did find a little bit of a padded area right here, but more importantly, you had this rubber pad, which was called the pass pad, basically in the area that you would be using to pass and control the ball. So this is just kind of like a grid pattern made out of a fairly firm rubber. It provided minimal amounts of grip on the ball, but I would say more importantly, it was a little bit firmer than the rest of the kanga-lite upper, so it gave you a slightly pingier sensation when passing the ball more than anything. I would say that's the defining characteristic, but the little padding here kind of around the outside, again, it just made for a really nice and very unique feel in comparison to everything else that was out there. It's also worth noting that this is a pre-ACC Nike football boot, although ACC would eventually be introduced on a control boot in the form of the CTR360 Maestri 3 several years later. Which begs the question, is it really a control boot without ACC? Like pretty much every other boot at that time, this did feature a pretty traditional low-cut construction, and there was also an internal plastic heel counter with a little bit of kind of like a mini heel counter at the back that I think was there more so for the sake of just a little bit of added rigidity in the lower parts to make sure that it wasn't unstable or anything like that. The heel is lined in a synthetic leather material, feels really nice. Then the insole, that's fully removable. I quite like this insole. I wish they would bring something like this back. The insoles in general from Nike, I think, used to be a lot better quality. It features this slightly kind of almost rubbery, but it's almost like a synthetic leather type material, but you can see it's heavily textured. I like the fact that it really matches the design of the boot as well, so visually it's quite nice, but it's made from a single layer of this perforated black foam, and then it has pour-on inserts in the heel as well as the forefoot. So it's not entirely different from, say, the current Tiempo insole, but it's still, I think, a little bit nicer than what we have now. And then moving to the sole plate and stud pattern, the sole plate was a relatively flexible plastic sole plate, nothing too fancy there, but the stud pattern was unique to the CTR360 line. You can see you have the 4 bladed studs in the heel, bladed studs lining the edges of the boot, but then in the middle you kind of have this circle design made up of these 3 studs, and that's really what they were trying to push with this particular stud pattern, was rotational movements. When you plant your foot into the ground, that ability to twist and pivot, because while this was a control boot, it was very much being heavily marketed towards midfielders that were constantly twisting and pivoting. And I think for that purpose, the stud pattern makes sense. I think it's a lot more aggressive than you might expect it to be, and I think a lot more aggressive than a lot of people gave it credit for at the time. But here's where there's a bit of a plot twist, because Nike now has 4 successful lines of football boots, something that had never really been done up until that point: Mercurial, T90, CTR360, and Tiempo. But just as it is now, the Nike Mercurial line was always the most popular. Something about being fast, the idea of speed, regardless of whether or not you're fast, is something that appeals to pretty much everybody. So while there were plenty of people that liked the other lines, a lot of people still really wanted Mercurials, and the idea of having a light boot especially is something that I think a lot of people really valued. So given that Nike had this carbon fiber sole plate, originally introduced on the Vapor 4 SL, eventually made its way onto the Superfly 1, and then available of course on the Superfly 2, which was kind of the flagship boot from Nike at the time, bearing a retail price of $400 US, they decided to take that carbon fiber sole plate and slap it on the other three lines, which is where this boot came into effect, the Nike CTR360 Maestri 1 Elite, which as you can see, features the exact same upper, nothing changes there, but the sole plate and stud pattern, not only are those completely different, but it's carbon fiber. So it was a little bit lighter, it certainly looked a lot cooler, and it was also a lot more expensive, bearing a retail price of $300 or $350, I can't remember, but it was basically $100 more than the regular version of the Maestri 1. Regardless of what it was, this football boot back in 2010 was more expensive than any of the top-end football boots Nike currently has on offer. So for those that continue to complain that football boots keep going up and up and up in price, actually, back 10 years ago, Nike football boots were way more expensive. Now, unfortunately for me, I did not have a pair of these as a kid, even though I really wanted them. They were just too expensive. But the carbon fiber sole plate, as you can see, visually, it is incredible, and in terms of a difference in feel, it's a little bit stiffer than the standard sole plate, and it also felt a lot thinner, so it sat you a little bit closer to the ground. I think it was a nice improvement over the standard plastic sole plate, and I don't want to flex it too much because I'm very worried about cracking it, which was also a pretty common issue when Nike first introduced these carbon fiber sole plates kind of more widespread, because the Superflies initially, they were very expensive, one, but they didn't really release too many pairs, so there weren't that many out there to actually break. Once these came out, they were widespread and people were breaking them left and right. And then the stud pattern wasn't really a new stud pattern. They kind of just took what they had on the T90 Laser series and they put it on this carbon fiber sole plate. So whether you got the T90 Laser Elite or the CTR360 Maestri Elite, you got the same stud pattern. And again, in comparison to the standard variation of the boot, I would say that this bladed stud pattern was ever so slightly more aggressive, which I think most people who were interested in a lighter variation of the CTR were pretty happy with. Cool factor aside, how much lighter is the Elite variation? And having both in my hands, these are both a size 9 US by the way, the Elite version does feel significantly lighter, but I'm gonna weigh them for you on a scale in real time. We'll start with the regular variation of the boot, and you can see that they weigh in at 10.5 ounces, the equivalent of 297 grams, which would basically make this, by today's standards, the heaviest top-end boot from any of the major brands. We'll pull these off the scale and we'll throw on the Elite variation with its carbon fiber sole plate, and you can see that they are legitimately lighter, 8.4 ounces, the equivalent of 238 grams. So that is a full 2 ounces less than the regular version of the Maestri 1, but by today's standard of top-end football boots, it's pretty average in terms of weight. That would put it at the same mark as an Adidas Predator 20.1 20 Plus, which is by no means a heavy football boot, but despite looking so cool and looking like it would be really light, it's not actually that light. On feet, I have to say that these boots still feel pretty good. I will admit that they're a little bit small for me. I could definitely use a 9.5 in both of these, but they're soft, they're relatively flexible. I definitely think that maybe they're bulky feeling by today's standards, and if I'm gonna compare this to some of the premium kangaroo leather boots that we have right now, I don't think that this kanga-lite feels quite as good, both on feet as well as on the ball. But as a whole, it's still a football boot that fits your foot very closely, which I think is something that you'll really notice as you go back in time in the world of football boots, is that everything fits better now than it once did. They just used to have a bulkier, wider, kind of higher volume fit, which I know a lot of people really like, but these don't seem to have that. The overall shape of this boot, Nike got just right. I think that's part of the reason why it was so successful back in the day, is it just fits really well. The off-centered lacing system does a good job of securing your foot in place. And again, despite being marketed as control boots, they feel very secure and are relatively responsive on feet as well. From a width perspective, I wouldn't say that that they are super wide, but they definitely would fit most people. And for whatever reason, if you're browsing eBay and you really want to get a pair for yourself that fit you, I would recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So to answer the main question, how does this hold up to not only just the control boots that we have now, but the football boots that we have now? Because if you follow the lineage of the CTR360 line, it eventually turned into Nike Magista. Magista eventually turned into Phantom Vision. So the Phantom Vision 2 would technically be the direct successor to a football boot like this. And again, they don't really compare all that well. I would say this much. I think that what this football boot did really well back in 2009, 2010 is it introduced the world to the potential of synthetic uppers, because I think up until that point, while the Mercurial series was very popular, the Tahitian synthetics that they were using were very plasticky, very rigid, and while the boots performed well, they were pretty uncomfortable, especially in comparison to all the football boots that we have now. Football boots have gotten way more comfortable out of the box than what they used to be. But this kanga-lite upper, it legitimately still feels soft to this day. The boots feel good. I think most people would consider this to feel a little bit bulky in comparison to a lot of the boots that we have now, but I still think that the concept holds up really well. I still think that the Elite model especially still looks like a football boot that would be up to the same, I guess, technology standard as a lot of the boots that we have now. And as long as you didn't mind that little bit of extra bulk, it's definitely wearable by today's standards. What I would personally really like to see, however, is this concept, these features modernized for 2020, because I really think that synthetics have progressed significantly more since we saw the introduction of this original kanga-lite upper. So with this same concept and all the new tech and knowledge that Nike currently has, I'd love to see what they do with a CTR360 Maestri 4, hypothetically, all the way in 2020. I think that's a football boot that a lot of people would get very excited about. And that concludes another retro review video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to support it with a like. If you have any questions regarding these boots or any suggestions for other boots you'd like to see a retro review of next, leave all of that down below in the comments and I'll do my best to get an answer out to you. If you aren't subscribed to the channel already, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you get notified when the next new video goes live. You can find all my social media information linked down below in the description as well. And other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.